Every game steals ideas, and every genre evolves because of it. That is nothing new. I have a more interesting question to answer. Why is it that some borrowed ideas can't transform a game, let alone reshape a whole genre, while others feel like they were added just for the sake of it? So I started looking at some of the industry's greatest games, and I think I finally found the answer. We all know that every genre has its own formula. For example, JRPGs are known for strategic turn-based combat. Souls games are known for challenging encounter and oppressive atmosphere. Roguelikes are built around repeated runs and starting over after every death. Those formulas exist for a reason. They are what made those genres successful in the first place. But every formula comes with its own trade-offs. And that got me thinking, what if the solution to those trade-offs doesn't exist inside the genre at all? What if the best way to evolve a genre is to borrow an idea from another one? One recent game actually answered these questions brilliantly. In most turn-based RPGs, almost all of your decisions happen on your turn. You choose your move, and when it is your enemy's turn, your role becomes more observational. You can see his attack coming, but all you can do is sit there and watch it happen. Now that isn't inherently a flaw. In fact, for many JRPG fans, that is exactly the appeal. Because with that game design, combat becomes all about strategy. But that same design also creates a trade-off. For players who prefer more active combat, waiting through enemy turns can make battles feel passive. Once you've made your move, all you can do is sit back and wait. And that is the problem Clair Obscur wanted to solve. Instead of looking for solutions inside the JRPG genre itself, the developers looked somewhere completely different. They looked at the Souls genre, a genre built around reading enemy attacks, reacting at precisely the right moment, and turning defense into an active part of the fight. Rather than abandoning turn-based combat completely, Clair Obscur took ideas from Souls games and made them part of the experience. And the result is that enemy turns become just as interactive as your own. Players now dodge, jump, and most importantly parry. This is what Sandfall calls reactive turn-based combat. Now you can debate whether Clair Obscur found the perfect balance. Some longtime JRPG fans argue that the parry system reduces the importance of planning and character building. If you can perfectly dodge or parry every attack, strategy becomes less important when compared to a traditional turn-based combat. And that is completely fair debate. But that's not the point of this video. What interests me is the design process that led to the system in the first place. Clair Obscur knew the experience it wanted to create. It wanted to preserve the strategic foundation of a JRPG while making combat more engaging during the enemy's turn. Whether you think that trade-off was worth it is entirely up to you. What is undeniable is that one of the year's most celebrated JRPGs achieved its identity by looking beyond the boundaries of the JRPG genre. Ironically, the very genre that inspired Clair Obscur had already evolved by looking outside its own boundaries. That brings us to Elden Ring. The Souls formula is very simple. You reach a difficult boss, you fight, you die, you learn, and then you try again. That loop isn't an unfortunate side effect of the genre. It is what defines Souls games. The satisfaction of finally defeating a boss comes from overcoming that struggle. But it also comes with a trade-off. When you hit a wall, your options are very limited. You can keep trying until you master the fight, grind the few resources available to you, or simply stop playing. Elden Ring didn't solve this by making its bosses easier. Instead, it looked outside the Souls genre for an answer. And the answer came from the open world genre. As Hidetaka Miyazaki himself explained, the freedom to leave and return later was an intentional part of the game's design. If a boss proves too difficult, players can simply explore somewhere else, become stronger, discover new equipments, and come back when they are ready. A difficult boss is no longer a dead end, it is one path among many. The challenge is still there. In many cases, Elden Ring's bosses are even more demanding than those in previous Souls games. So instead of reducing the difficulty, the game gives players more control over when and how they choose to face it. Of course, this approach comes with its own trade-offs. Open worlds can hurt pacing, overwhelm players with too much freedom, or become filled with repetitive content. Elden Ring manages to avoid many of those pitfalls, but again, that's not the point I'm trying to make. What matters to me is that the open world wasn't there just to make the game bigger. It gave players another way to deal with failure. And just like Clair Obscur, Elden Ring understood the experience it wanted to create. Instead of looking for the solution within its own genre, it looked somewhere else, and eventually was able to reshape the Souls formula around it. And once you start looking for this pattern, you begin to see it everywhere. Persona realized that character progression didn't have to happen only inside dungeons, so it borrowed life simulation mechanics, making your everyday relationships, school life, and social choices just as important as the battle themselves. On the other hand, Hades looked at the repetitive nature of roguelikes and asked a different question. What if failure didn't stop the story, but rather, it advanced it? By borrowing persistent storytelling and character relationships from genres like JRPG, every death became another step forward instead of a complete reset. And then there is Balatro. On paper, making a hit game out of poker sounds ridiculous. But Balatro borrowed progression, powerful builds, and endless experimentation from roguelites and somehow made it work. So if stealing mechanics from other genres is the secret, why doesn't it always work? Let us take Pokemon Scarlet and Violet as an example. For years, fans had been asking Pokemon to evolve, so Game Freak did what many other developers were doing at the time. They went open world. On paper, it sounded like exactly what the series needed. But here's the difference. In Elden Ring, the open world fundamentally changes how you approach difficulty. Exploration becomes part of the progression itself. If you hit a wall, the world naturally gives you other meaningful paths to follow. Scarlet and Violet offers a similar promise of freedom, but many of its underlying systems still behave as if the game were linear. Gym leaders and wild Pokemon don't scale with your progress, so while you're technically free to travel almost anywhere, the game quietly pushes you back toward a specific path. Now that is not to say that the open world was a bad idea. In the end, many players enjoyed the greater sense of exploration it brought, but in my view, it addressed a symptom rather than the disease. Yes, the world became larger, but many of the criticisms that had followed the series for years remained. Battles still rewarded over-leveling more than strategic play, and gym leaders still relied on monotype teams, encouraging type matchups rather than deeper team building or tactical decision-making. Donkey Kong Bonanza offers a different kind of example. If you've played Super Mario Odyssey before, you'll remember that collecting Power Moons mainly unlock new kingdoms during the story and extra content after the credits. Bonanza takes that idea one step further. Every Bonandium gem contributes to an RPG-style skill tree. Instead of simply collecting for completion, every banana now helps Donkey Kong grow stronger. On paper, it is a smart idea, but in my view, it never reaches its full potential. I actually break down why this is the case in much more detail in my Donkey Kong Bonanza review. But, as a summary, progression systems only matter when the game gives you a reason to use them. Bonanza rarely does. The game is so forgiving that many of the upgrades feel optional. The skill tree rarely changes how you actually play the game. Looking back at all of these examples, one thing becomes very clear. Great games don't borrow ideas for the sake of borrowing them. They borrow ideas to solve a specific problem. Clair Obscur didn't borrow parries because parries were popular at the time. It borrowed them because they solved a limitation of traditional turn-based combat. Elden Ring didn't become open world because open worlds were the industry's biggest trend. It became open world because it gave players another way to overcome failure, without compromising the challenge that defines the Souls genre. And on the other side, games like Scarlet and Violet, and to a certain extent Donkey Kong Bonanza, show that borrowing a mechanic isn't enough on its own. If that mechanic doesn't solve a meaningful problem, then it becomes just another feature. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.